Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for Navigate the Farm Bill, What's at Stake for Food Policy Councils. We're going to go ahead and get started. I understand that if you're looking at the slides, there might be a clipboard in the middle of your screen. I'm not really sure how to get rid of that, and hopefully it's not too distracting and minimal. But just know that we are aware that there is a clipboard, a mysterious clipboard that is showing up in the middle of everyone's screen. Today, we're excited to present a webinar that focuses on the Farm Bill with Parke, Wilde, and Alan Hunt, and the conversation will be moderated by Mark Winnie, who's a senior advisor with the Center for a Livable Future. Our conversation today is going to be about the Farm Bill and what matters most to our work in community food systems. My name is Karen Bassarab, and I'm a program officer with the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future and the Food Policy Networks Project. I'm going to start us off this afternoon talking a little bit about the software we're using and also provide you with a brief overview of the Center for a Livable Future for those of you who are not familiar with us. So to start, the platform that we're using today is called Zoom. It's a video conferencing and webinar system. All attendees are muted and will remain in listen-only mode for the duration of the webinar. Today's discussion will be a bit different in that it'll be a conversation between Mark, Parke, and Alan. There'll be a few slides, but the majority of the time, you will get to see our presenters and they'll be having a conversation. We'd love for you to engage, ask questions, and let our panelists know kind of some thoughts or your questions. You can do that in two ways. There's a chat box, as well as the Q&A box. You can type your comments into the chat box and your questions into the Q&A box. We will be moderating those questions throughout the webinar. We will also be asking them of our panelists throughout the webinar, so you don't have to wait until the very end. And then also, we will be recording our webinar today. So for those that want to go back and listen, view it or listen to it, and for those that are unable to attend, we will be sharing it after the webinar. So to start, we wanted to tell you a little bit about the Center for a Livable Future. The Center for a Livable Future is an interdisciplinary center located at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health in Baltimore, Maryland. Our work focuses on the intersection of diet, environment, food production, and public health. Sorry, I'm trying to get to the next slide to show you what we do. There we go. Our education program includes a food systems certificate, food systems coursework, curriculum development, and support of doctoral fellowships. We also conduct research, support other faculty members, research, and collaborate with other research institutions. We have 4 program areas with the Center for a Livable Future. The Food Policy Networks Project is one of the projects underneath our programs. The goal of the Food Policy Networks Project is to build the capacity of food system stakeholders to reform local, state, regional, and tribal food systems through effective public policy. We do this through a number of ways, one being training, sharing best practices, networking with other food policy groups and leaders, and developing and providing food policy resources and materials. As you can see on the slide, we have a number of ways that people can engage with the network. One is through a listserv, which has about 1,200 members. Another is through a Food Policy Council directory, which lists food policy councils in both the United States and Canada. Thirdly, we have the Food Policy Resource Database, which has over 900 resources on food policy and food policy councils. We also host regular webinars and also conference calls with interested food policy councils and peer organizations, similar to the webinar today. And we provide technical assistance and training through workshops at conferences as well as in-person trainings. So if you aren't familiar with the Food Policy Networks Project and you want to learn more about these resources that are available, you can go to our website, which is foodpolicynetworks.org. For today, we're really going to be focusing on federal level policy. And this webinar is part of a new ongoing initiative of the Food Policy Networks Project to offer food policy councils and peer organizations that are wishing to influence federal food and farm policy, a place where they can learn about federal policy and connect with national advocates and policymakers. Through this initiative, we have several goals. We hope to build our understanding of the federal policymaking process, grow our capacity to advocate for policy across all levels of government, share our local experiences with national decision makers to inform federal policy, coordinate support for federal action, and connect local groups to national advocates and policymakers. If you are interested in joining us to learn more about what's happening at the federal level, we encourage you to join our Food Policy Network's listserv. We will have another webinar coming up on September 21st with Bob Martin from the Center for a Livable Future to talk about the federal budget process. This afternoon, we're going to spend the time exploring what is the Farm Bill and why does it matter to food policy councils, and how can we engage in shaping the contents of the Farm Bill. With that, I'll turn it over to Mark Winnie. He's going to introduce our speakers and kick off the conversation.
The Mountain Time Zone, as I am, or the Pacific Time Zone, good morning. And if you're Central or Eastern, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. We have two stellar gentlemen with us who are going to be sharing some of their wisdom about the Farm Bill. And as Karen said, this is really an important moment for us, an important policy moment for us in this country, because the Farm Bill really is the most critical piece of food, nutrition, and agriculture legislation that the country takes up, and we only do it once every 5 years. Usually the process often stretches beyond 5 years, but never, before we get a new Farm Bill. However, it is an important time for us, and it's really important for the local and state organizations, food policy councils, and other similar coalitions to have their voices heard, to kind of think about what their issues are at the local level and how they can be brought forward to the national level. And we're going to discuss some of that today. A lot of the legislation that you will find in the Farm Bill has often originated in one form or another at the local or state level. So it's you might say an incubator for good ideas that can be brought and scaled up nationally. So I just want to quickly review our agenda. We have it really in three parts. First two parts, both Alan and Parke will be presenting. But they'll be doing it in brief segments, 5 to 7 minutes each. The first segment will be looking at the question of why the Farm Bill matters. And then the second segment will be looking more closely at programs and other sections or titles of the Farm Bill and how they relate to some of the work that people are doing across the country. And then the last segment will focus on the on Q&A, some discussion between me and Parke and Alan and you, the audience. So please make note of your questions and comments as we're going and as you're listening, and we will do our best to get to them when the time arises. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Parke Wilde, first off. And Parke is a food economist at the Friedman School of Nutrition, Science, and Policy at Tufts. Previously, he worked at the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Economic Research Service. While at Tufts, Parke teaches graduate-level courses in statistics and U.S. food policy. His research addresses food security and hunger measurement, the economics of food assistance programs, and federal dietary guidance policy. Parke keeps a blog at usfoodpolicy.com, and he has a book titled Food Policy in the United States, an Introduction, that came out in 2013, but we understand that a revision is going to be issued in 2018. So we look forward to seeing that. So welcome, Parke. Now, Alan Hunt has spent more than 10 years, I understand, working on national policy for local and healthy food systems. A lot of that work has taken place at nonprofit organizations such as Wholesome Wave, the Wallace Center, and the Northeast Midwest Institute, and through his own consulting company, Local Food Strategies. His book, Civic Engagement in Food System Governance, compares the United States and the United Kingdom's food movement. He currently serves as the executive director of the Musconetcong Watershed Association in Asbury, New Jersey. And as a New Jersey native myself, I apologize for probably not pronouncing Musconetcong correctly. So we are going to start off with Parke. Thank you for being here, and please take it away.
Sure. I just wanted to say a word about why the nutrition title of the Farm Bill matters. You know, the Farm Bill is the omnibus legislation that once every 5 years reauthorizes all sorts of food and nutrition programs. And when you ask anybody in their area of work you know, how important is the topic they're covering, they'll tell you, oh, this is the really important part. And yet, in the case of the nutrition title, it is by many measures. If you think about somebody covering governance either on the Hill or in the executive branch on food and agriculture, and they're thinking about the Farm Bill, just by budget alone, the nutrition title is exceedingly important. So this covers the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. It covers TFAP, the Emergency Food Assistance Program, Commodity Supplemental Food Program, and several smaller programs. It's responsible for approximately 80% of the budget of the whole Farm Bill, and so it's a big part of federal spending, even if it's not quite such a big part of the kind of brain time that senior food and agriculture officials spend thinking about the programs in their jurisdiction. But also, I was thinking about people on food policy councils concerned about hunger in their communities. There's a lot of interest in emergency food programs, which is also an important part of the Farm Bill. But the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program also is particularly important from an anti-hunger perspective. It's by giving people the purchasing power to buy the food that they need through normal retail channels, it has a big effect on reducing food insecurity and hunger in the United States. And that's important. The recent statistics from USDA for the year 2016 just came out yesterday. And there's been slow progress in recent years, but not fast enough. And so as a nation, it's a source of embarrassment that we have as many food insecure and hungry people as we do. And the SNAP program is an important part of the social safety net that's designed to respond to that. But I was thinking even about people with other interests. If your interest is in the grocery retail sector locally, in recent years, about 10% of all grocery food spending has been from the SNAP program. So like, even if your interest wasn't in low-income retail in particular, but just were in retail, this would be a big part of your consumer demand. The same's true for all the people in food policy councils working locally on local food retail access. It's, you know, we spend a lot of our time thinking about where we would like to locate new retailers. But one of the fundamental features of the economics of food retail in the United States is that the retailers are going to locate where there's buying power. And if it wasn't for the nutrition title of the Farm Bill, the buying power that low-income Americans have would be vastly lower. And so even for local food retail access issues, I think the nutrition title of the Farm Bill is something that people could take a lot of interest in. It's also going to be a big part of the policy debate in the coming year. There's going to be proposals in Congress to block grant the SNAP program, which is a way of breaking the automatic stabilizer effect that it has, where the budget automatically goes up during lean times and automatically comes back down during macroeconomic expansions. But there's also going to be proposals for increasing the benefit, for decreasing the benefit, and for changing the program's targeting on nutrition issues. Things like proposing to have stronger incentives for fruit and vegetable purchase through SNAP, or to restrict purchase of sugar-sweetened beverages through SNAP. And so all of these are things that we can look forward to in the coming year of debate over the nutrition title.
Parke, that was wonderful. We'll come back to more in a few minutes, but now we're going to hear from Alan Hunt, who's going to give us a bit more of the perspective on food programs contained within the Farm Bill that have an impact on local food systems. Alan, thank you.
Hi there, I'm Alan Hunt, and hold on. I have some background noise here. Let me see if I can go take care of that. I'll be back in just a second.
Karen and Mark, I'll be glad to take a second question while he has background noise if you want it.
Well, do you want to expand a little bit on what you were saying? Take a minute on that. We're still going to come back to you.
I imagine a lot of people in food policy councils are going to be interested in the part that has to do with nutrition, um, sort of improvements in dietary quality through the SNAP program. And this is something where I think it's useful for people who care about public health and nutrition, and people who care about hunger prevention and food security, to have internal conversations that really involve listening to each other well, before this gets to the main stage of public policy debate about it. Because for people who are all basically supporters of nutrition assistance programs and hunger prevention and good nutrition, there's a danger of having the arguments that are most public do damage, and that it's useful to sort of think through, negotiate some of those decisions in advance. And that was on my mind here in the early stages of Farm Bill debate for the next cycle.
Good thought, good addition. So we got it under control, Alan?
I'm all good now.
All right, take it away.
So the way I look at the Farm Bill, about why it matters the most, is that it's the single biggest opportunity to change policy around food production, rural development, addressing food insecurity, health, nutrition, all that's wrapped in the Farm Bill. I was going to lead you through kind of my wisdom in the, I think, 7 slides here about what I've learned about the Farm Bill from working on it and researching it. So I did my doctoral research looking at how people promoting local food systems got their policies through the Farm Bill over the last 40 years. And I compared it to how folks in the United Kingdom got their equivalent policies through. And what you'll just see here is the stuff from the US, which I think is most useful to everyone. But just so you know, there was a comparative study that drew out kind of the key findings in this. So if you think about the Farm Bill, it's really a political creation. That's why you get these unusual alliances of farmers and nutrition folks working together on a very large piece of legislation. And the agriculture committees in the House and in the Senate really drive the process. It's about what their local politics are about and the politics of the agriculture sector. So I found it always most useful to understand the issues from the agriculture committee's perspective. And from what they look at is that the US is becoming more urban. There's fewer and fewer rural and agricultural districts. And so that means if you're going to pass a policy that involves agricultural legislation, you've got to bring in people who aren't from agricultural and rural districts. And they've been very smart about how they've done this over time. In the 1970s, they brought in the consumer food movement and nutrition interests. In the 1980s, they brought in the environmental groups. In the 1990s, the sustainable agriculture and community food groups were brought in. And in the 2000s and 2010s, local food and health were added to the Farm Bill. And it's this process of accommodating these outside interests and making them insiders to the process. So now that each of these groups that you see here on the slide are politically necessary for passing the Farm Bill. And that creates opportunities for congressional engagement. But your access does depend upon your message and your tactics. It's about working with the committee, working with other sectors, and not trying to break the glass in the glass house. So how's it worked? So if we looked at local food policies at the national level, and this would be in the Farm Bill and also the Child Nutrition Act, they've increased over time. Hold on, going back 1 slide. There we go. The first one was introduced in 1976. It was the Farm to Consumer Direct Marketing Act. And since then, there have been 19 policies introduced. And in general, they've come at when the Farm Bill or the Child Nutrition Act has come up. It started out at about $1 million a year, and there's at least $417.5 million a year going out from the USDA that can be used for local and regional food systems. There's other policy provisions, such as the local preference and school meals, that are probably worth well more than that dollar amount in terms of grants. So with that increasing access has come increased funding. But it has taken time, and we call it incrementalism because it's incremental change. How's it happened? Well, there's been a variety of different movements that have talked about food and agriculture and local food to some degree. That's what you see here, and they've had different starting points, and many of your food policy councils will have different emphases, perhaps drawing from these different movements. Local food systems is really a synergy of those interests and of those different perspectives, and really has grown because it's focused on including other perspectives in the policymaking for local food systems. So in the 1970s, this was primarily thought about, supporting farmers and making food affordable to consumers through farmers markets. This changed over time. It's included sustainable agriculture, community food security, and more lately, even more objectives are intended to be met from a single policy proposal on local food systems. So I'm going to show you an example of this quickly. So this is from 2008. This is a paragraph of a letter from members of Congress to the Agriculture Committee saying, support healthy food and independent farms, and we want you to include this in the Farm Bill. And the underlines correspond to different narratives or different groups. So some of this is about farm production, some of it's sustainable agriculture, some of it's public health, civil rights, community food, and food justice. And they're blended together. So in this single paragraph, you see the language from 5 different social movements included in there. And their policies that were being proposed resulted in the same way. So those same narratives about how food and food policy should address rural communities or health or hunger for different people were used in the actual policymaking as reflected in legislation. So Congress is also amenable to this approach, and it's worked over time. So why has this worked over 40 years? And this is what my research focused on and identified, was that there is a defined playbook used in the field, and I called it a theory of food systems practice. We're probably all familiar with the term of food systems, and when I broke it down, these seemed like 6 essential components of what people were thinking of when they meant food systems. It includes multiple sectors, so it's not just producers and consumers or rural or urban. It's many levels. It's local, state, regional, federal. So even though this might be federal policy, it might be saying you can use this funding to change local, county, or state policy, as in community food projects. It's participatory, that the stakeholders were involved in the decision-making when the policies were proposed, but then also they were involved in being on a peer review panel for reviewing the grants. Or maybe there was a cooperative agreement to a practitioner group to implement a program. It's interdisciplinary, which means it's not a single worldview. It's not just agriculture or economics or health or social justice, but it's a fusion of all of them. And there's multiple objectives and multiple problems being solved simultaneously. So it might be local food and farm income, local food and food access, local food and health. And what I mean by inclusive is that over time, more and more issues and more groups were given space in the advocacy and the policies for this, and that made it stronger. So if you want the really simple takeaway about what worked, was that people became more organized over time, and they brought in more and more unusual alliances. Consumers working with farmers, groups that cared about environment working with farmers, people caring about urban food security working with rural groups. And that's really what's worked. Congress favors that. They like it because it resolves conflict, and it means there's more broad support for the risk that they're taking to introduce policy. So it really comes down to collaboration.
That's taking a pause here and going to turn it back to Parke. And we'll come back to Alan one more time before we open it up. But before we do that, Karen, I just want to ask, I'm not seeing any sidebars or information about questions or anything coming in on my screen. I don't know if I'm doing something wrong or you control something.
Nope, you're not missing anything, Mark. Just another plug that please feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A box or the chat box. We will be asking them of the panelists as we go through. So if you have a question, burning question, please submit it now.
Yeah, this is a good time to get your thoughts into the conversation. So as something resonates with you, write it down and send it in to us. So thank you, Alan. I think that gave us a good look at how the interests have evolved and how more groups and more interests have become involved in the Farm Bill over the past 20 or 30 years. The history of that is fascinating, really, and it really kind of speaks to the opportunity for more participation by local and state groups. Parke, we're going to go back to you now and ask you to talk a little bit about some of the trends in political interests that have joined on the bandwagon, or maybe in some cases tried to throw stones at the bandwagon. So take it away.
You can see that the organization here included some attention in the first section to the nutrition title, and then using this as an opportunity to think about some of the other titles that are there. And I think having this webinar in a conversational format is already instructive. I'm on the fly thinking about what was interesting in Alan's comments of some additional things I have to say about this, because from the perspective of people who care about nutrition and community food issues, Alan pointed out the advantage of inclusion in the Farm Bill, which is that having more and more people at the table is all good in terms of the political muscle that one gets to bring to bear on policymaking. But it could have a downside, and it depends on what the different participants in this inclusive process think of the different sections. And so this is sort of our chance to think, as people who care about local food policy issues, about some of the titles that are the kind of like, sometimes I think my students think of this as the slightly more boring titles, about like traditional farm programs and things like that. But I think it's good for all of us to have a sense of what's in some of these other titles of the Farm Bill also. Traditionally with crop insurance, I think there's sort of a standard view about what goes on with crop insurance that's now a little bit dated. I think from the 1930s, when a lot of these programs started, to the 1960s, crop insurance was designed to boost the market price. And then in the 1970s, there was a tradition of developing programs that pay farmers for the differential, for the difference between the market prices, which were seen as too low, and the target price that the government was supposed to aim for. And if you read, for example, Michael Pollan's book Omnivore's Dilemma, or other major critiques of farm subsidy programs, this tends to be the type of program that they have in mind. But especially in the last couple farm bills, the 2014 Farm Bill and the one coming up, there's been a substantial shift, even out of those deficiency payment programs. And so the current farm subsidy bundle of programs is heavily weighted towards crop insurance. And this requires thinking through kind of its own arcane world. But these include basically, to make sense of these crop insurance style farm subsidy programs, they're full of all kinds of complex detail, but each of them has a common pattern, which is that there's some condition that triggers a payout to the farmer under certain circumstances. And then there's a certain amount there's a calculation of how much the farmer gets paid. And the question, all the variation is, what is the circumstance that triggers a payout? And so some of the programs, called countercyclical programs, the payout is just low prices. And for others of the programs, traditional crop insurance, the payout was bad weather that caused you to lose part of your crop. And now in the Farm Bill, there's a bunch of hybrid programs that have sort of a mix of partly paying out based on prices and partly paying out based on how much your production got hampered. And so, I think even for people who don't consider those programs to be their main interest, they're worth paying attention to. But the Farm Bill also has major conservation programs. So if you care about the sustainability of our food system and natural resources and the environment, the Farm Bill also has programs related to those topics that are important to the policy debate. For example, the Conservation Reserve Program sets aside marginal lands, offers farmers some compensation for being willing to take some land that was at risk of overproduction out of production in order to protect habitat or to protect erosion and other characteristics. There's also working lands programs. So even while land is in production, the farmers get essentially some government help with the investments that they need to make for everything from better fencing to protect wildlife at the margins of their land, to better holding ponds for the manure that comes out of their agricultural that comes out from their animal agriculture production. And each of these has strengths and weaknesses. Sometimes they incentivize more environmentally sound production, but they also offer payments to the whole reason why particular types of farms need the environmental incentives is because they've got substantial environmental impact. And so there's a lot to think through. So when you think about inclusion, you're thinking about the political power that one gets from being in an omnibus bill, from sort of a mixed topic bill that has all of these different topics, but you're also thinking about whether some of the policies in these other titles are so different from the public interest that you're paying attention to that you actually don't want to be a part of it. So it happens on every Farm Bill cycle that various important constituencies contemplate breaking up, having a little divorce. You'll hear this from severe conservative budget critics of the Farm Bill who ask themselves, do we really need to support the SNAP program in order to get the policies passed that we need? And they'll wonder if they could have passed farm policy without the help of people who care about low-income Americans. And the same thing, if you follow the message boards and Twitter, you'll see among generally more progressive people concerned about the food system and low-income Americans, wondering if they really need to support commercial agriculture or if the Farm Bill could have passed without them. And what's happened in the past is that staring down this, contemplating that possibility, everybody tends to make up. They sort of tend to decide that, we're better off together. And so you'll see currently at this stage of the political process for the next Farm Bill, there is, sort of around the country, there will be right about now anti-hunger organizations meeting with leading farm organizations just to make sure that their relationships are still there, that they, even though they don't agree on every topic, that they know who to call for talking over different policy issues. And I think that happens that can fruitfully happen at the local level as well as at the level of sort of national organizations such as the National Farmers Union or the Food Research and Action Center and the other major public interest organizations.
Parke, before I move on back to Alan, I just take up that last phrase, really. Who do you think are the organizations that we need to be paying most attention to?
So each of these areas of policy has a network of important organizations that are most influential. And so for some of these topics, I'll know them all by name, and for others, I'll sort of only know them by type. But in anti-hunger organizations, one thinks of national organizations such as the Food Research and Action Center, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and a few other organizations, some of which have local and regional organizations that fall in the same style. So for example, here in Massachusetts, the kind of nutrition assistance program advocacy organizations called the Massachusetts Law Reform Institute. There's also an organization called Project Bread. And so for each of these, they're sort of in the same family of organizations. Among them, moving outside of that comfort zone with public interest organizations, among the major farm policy organizations, there's two major national multi-product lobbies, and that's the American Farm Bureau Federation, which tends to skew slightly more conservative, and the National Farmers Union, which tends to skew slightly more democratic friendly, but neither of them is partisan organizations. Both of them are careful to work with people on both sides of the aisle. Then on the conservation programs, you'd have the Environmental Working Group is very involved in farm policy. So there's national organizations in each of these areas.
Great, thank you. All right, Alan, we're going to ask you to take a kind of help us think a little bit about how we become more influential from the local and state level, and take a look at some of the decision-making process that goes on in committees and in Congress, and presumably with some ideas of points of contact for us.
Yeah, so are you thinking about like how, if folks want to get engaged, where should they get engaged, what steps they can take?
Right, and timing too. Timing is important as well.
Yeah, so the Farm Bill expires, I think it's the end of September 2018. And most of the programs in the Farm Bill are on a 5-year authorization, so they expire then. Some are on 10-year and would continue for another 5 years if there was no Farm Bill. You know, there's a couple different things to do, and it depends upon a bit what your relationships are. If you're primarily working in a community or consider yourself a grassroots group, you know, the essential thing for you to do is to learn a bit about the Farm Bill, and also have your members of Congress and the senators out to visit what you do, or meet them at their office and talk about them. And it's fine to do that with the in-district staff. The way to really magnify your outreach and your political knowledge and your reach, and to get more into DC, I think, is by participating through some of the nonprofit organizations that focus on federal policies. So for example, the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition is a great resource. They do farmer fly-ins, which of course includes groups that aren't farmers. And I found like that's a really good resource there. I think Mark wants to talk a bit more about food policy councils and how this group can do a bit more outreach as well. There's also some opportunities too, and it depends upon how close you are to some of the farm organizations. You can think about how to change within the farming community. And one of the projects I worked on was trying to shift the narrative around local food. We called it retail agriculture. And because I switched the narrative around, the local food policies wound up going in a bunch of Farm Bureau, state Farm Bureau policy platforms to support local food. And they called it retail agriculture, but they talked all about local food. So sometimes there's ways to get groups that you think might be your opponents or more difficult to work with to adopt your policies if you meet with them and learn their language, not selling out, not changing what you do, but just finding out what the connections are. And then they're less resistant to the change that you want to pursue. That's really important, is nullifying the change, nullifying potential opponents.
We're hearing a lot right now about marker bills. Mm-hmm. And tell us a little bit about what their role is and how we might become involved.
Sure. So even though we talk about this Farm Bill being in 2018, the planning in the Farm Bill usually starts at least a year before, if not 2 years before. And groups will work together and figure out what their ideas are and their policy priorities, and then they'll find their supporters in the Congress. It is generally most advantageous to find supporters on the agricultural committees, and because they would be the ones who would actually bring up your bill, your marker bill, into the committee process, so it could be included as part of the chairman's bill. If it's in the chairman's bill, it stands on pretty good legs getting into the conference committee bill or the final farm bill, and that's assuming that there's all normal process going on. But that marker bill is really the key signal for saying, these issues are important, here are the groups that care about it, here's the members who care about it, including like what regions and states they're from, and the number of supporters you have. Even if you don't have members of the Ag Committee supporting it, if you've got a good block of urban representatives, minority representatives, or from other key districts, your policy might go a fairly long way and be included.
I want to build on one thing you said, which is suggesting that food policy councils meet with their congressional district offices. I think that's, is the timing right for that? Is that a good, do we need to have ourselves organized and have a good, clear message when we meet with them?
Yes, and you can definitely expect that other groups working on the Farm Bill have already had their meetings with their members. We just finished up in a longer summer congressional recess, so folks have been out to their fairs and looking at the farms and meeting with groups like Farm Bureau or different producer groups. So if you're thinking that you want to interact on the Farm Bill, it's definitely the time to do it because everybody else is.
I would also add it's a good way for your member of Congress to learn about your food policy council. They may not be familiar with it. They may not know what it is. They may not understand what its role is. So it's a good good opportunity to educate your members about this local and or state group that you may have. Parke, did you want to add anything on the, with respect to either marker bills or interacting with your district offices or sort of other opportunities for immediate engagement?
I think that those that's a great list, and the other one is to be engaged with local media. So in addition to national media, to pay attention to the local outlets where they're going to be very glad to have material, and your engagement is also productive.
So Karen, I'm looking for questions. Are we? Do I need to click on the Q&A box?
There's some questions that came through in the Q&A box, and then there are a bunch that were sent to you through the chat as well. We've got a lot. You want me to start with one?
How do I see? I'm not seeing them.
Do you have the Q&A box open?
All right. Okay, now it's covering. Okay. Are there any that have stood out for you? Because I'm looking at this list for the first time.
There were a couple of questions. There was one in particular that goes back to Parke's conversation about crop insurance. And one of the questions was kind of, what do you see? Sorry.
Yeah.
What do you
Let me
see
take that one.
That are going to be coming up in the 2018 Farm Bill with crop insurance?
So crop insurance, I'm not quite sure what to say on it. The first thing is, I think from the perspective of somebody who cares about sustainable agriculture, one of the interesting things is that crop insurance is more open to participation by small and sustainable producers than some of the other major subsidy programs is. So, for example, fruit and vegetable growers have more access to crop insurance than they did to the older deficiency payment programs. But there's still some challenges. So, for example, in a crop insurance scheme, if you're producing a premium product, then the insurance program may not serve you well because it's reimbursement in the event that something bad happens, like either bad weather or low prices, may be assuming you're producing the commodity product. And so if you're producing or organic product or a premium product in some way for local production, then what they're reimbursing you for in the crop insurance program may not actually be in the ballpark of what your losses were. And so there's things that one could ask for from a sustainable agriculture perspective in crop insurance. But I can't help suggesting that the other thing to ask for is that this beast not get too out of hand, because it has been a way of returning to heavy farm subsidies at a time when crop prices were high. So when crop prices are high, deficiency payments and other traditional farm supports are kind of out of the money. They only pay out when crop prices are low. And so during a high crop price period, federal government spending on farm subsidies ought by nature to be quite low. And so crop insurance is kind of a way of having substantial subsidies even during a fairly high price environment. And so that's kind of a negative thing to suggest, but the other, it's in a way suggesting not letting these crop insurance programs get too out of hand.
I'm going to this is building off of a question we have about how do we bring sort of a united voice from food policy councils to Washington? And that, of course, won't be an easy task, but of course, if you're going to have a united voice, it would suggest that you have a united message. And I'd like to ask Alan if you have any thoughts on, looking ahead, both based on, what the opportunities might be for new or expanded or enhanced programs that address local issues. Any thoughts on what the right kind of message ought to be? What should the story be? Or what are some of the opportunities to build some effective collaborations around certain issues?
So Mark set me up there to answer about a dozen questions. So I'm going to narrow this down a little bit. I see George here had asked a question in the chat box about, he says he staffs the municipal food policy council, and he finds it challenging to identify the role the council should take in changing food systems at a broader level than just the municipality. And is basically asking, like, well, what would I do to engage more in the Farm Bill? So I think that's a great question, and I think that kind of gets at a bit at the heart of what you're asking, Mark.
That's right.
So,
Alan, before you answer, I would add to that, George, and there was another question too, in particular about food policy councils that are embedded in local governments and how they get engaged as well.
Yeah. So I would think, like, for this, thinking about what George had raised, I think one of the most important would be having your member come out or to a place where you have a project. If you don't have a project because you don't do projects and primarily meet, go meet with them and just tell them about, here's how these federal policies are used in the area that we focus on. SNAP comes into here, or these groups got a farmers market and local food promotion program grant here. Or the commodity food supplemental program is used here. Just make them aware that they can string the connection of issues from the federal government, from USDA, back to the local community and make those connections. I mean, that's been one of my biggest shifts in working on federal policy, and then now working at a grassroots group is, the member kind of knows about some of these issues, but being able to go in and say, this big federal program that everybody's talking about like they want to cut, it's actually doing a lot of important work back here. And then their eyes just go wide, and they really understand what's going on because you made a connection. I think that's something that probably every food policy council could be doing, is that type of work.
Parke, you have any thought on the message, on what we ought to be uniting around, or what some of the potential, what opportunities might be for that kind of coming together?
Yeah, so in a way, I'm noticing in some of the questions, there's questions about kind of a common message, but also about whether, just partly for political reasons, for reasons of sort of maintaining a multi-sector alliance, whether there's reasons to support particular policies. But let's take the principle. The principle is, I think that you would get farmers and non-farmers, sustainable agriculture advocates, and major commercial producers on the same page about certain principles when you sort of articulate the principles broadly. Everybody thinks we ought to have more food security and less hunger in the United States. And so policies that are very directly effective on that have appeal for farmers. Farmers of all stripes take pride in the fact that people who need food eat their product, right? Like, it's a source of pride in addition to the money that they make. And the same is true for having a basic social safety net for farmers. The idea that when there's a hurricane, like, just to take a completely hypothetical example, when there's a hurricane and there's major crop losses, that the federal government should play a role in protecting farmers, has widespread public interest support and isn't just a farm lobby thing to ask for. And the same is true for even economic conditions, such as protecting farmers from the boom and bust of a major crash in prices. So these are common themes, they take environmental issues. So you will have sustainable agriculture advocates asking for many things on environmental issues that a lot of commercial producers won't really take interest in or will even oppose. But on some of the big, most important environmental issues of the day, such as too much nutrients flowing down the Mississippi Valley and causing dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico, there's widespread recognition, even among commercial farmers, that the current system is serving the public interest badly by not tackling this issue. You think about how the coverage was in Iowa of Des Moines' lawsuit against the upstream counties that were releasing too much nitrogen into the waterways and making it difficult for the municipal water supply in Des Moines. This finally is starting to trigger people's conscience, and so I think that there's a lot of ground for building coalition based on principle, and then once the principle runs out, for a little bit of horse trading.
What do you think the potential is to build more around the concept of local food? I mean, it seems to me that the idea of locally produced food, perhaps organic and sustainably produced food as well, has sort of reached a point where it's not like it's controversial anymore. You know, this is a good thing. Everybody along most political spectrums seems to accept it. Any places, either Alan or Parke, where we might be able to, build some momentum around that?
Yeah. So let me go first, because I've got a question that I'd be actually interested to hear from Alan on. I don't hear it so much from farmers, maybe some, but especially from my colleagues in agricultural economics. Beyond a certain point, local food advocacy makes them nervous because they're worried about inefficiencies. At a time when the world needs lots of food, they sort of want the food production system to be efficient, and they're concerned about a loss of it if there's too much emphasis on local food. And when I argue about this with them, I say, yeah, but like, at what level are we worried about that? Currently, a very small percentage of U.S. food is sold direct to consumers. So if you think about all the interest that we have in farmers markets and in community-supported agriculture, it still amounts to a fairly small percentage. And that could double or triple, create sort of a wholesome, vibrant sense of the local food environment in a way that's going to sort of promote health and increase our sense of appeal and local connections between farmers and consumers, without threatening the overall efficiency of our food system, right? And so the question is, what amount of, I was thinking for Alan, for example, to what extent would this concern from agricultural economists be something that you would just neglect outright or reject outright, or to what extent would you sort of acknowledge it in part? I've got a big interest in sort of mid-scale local commercial agriculture, right? Something that's bigger than production for the local farmers market, but is much smaller than Cargill, right? And I think there's things to be done at that scale that I find really interesting. Okay,
I will answer Parke's question and Mark's question. I will do this succinctly. What I say about economic efficiency, if we look at this is concept of a retail food dollar. And if you Google this, you can find it. And if you look at it, about 80% of the average food product is in the price that you pay is in food marketing. That doesn't seem really efficient to me, because it's not, the production might be efficient, but the distribution system is not really efficient. 80% of it is lost in distribution and marketing. If you flip it around to be more localized, the farmer captures more of that, even on a regional level. The other way to think about it is also profit per acre, or value generated per acre. Where I live, I've got lots of great farmland, and there's like half a dozen farmers farming 8,000 acres because it takes very little labor to do row crops. But we're 50 miles from New York. Could you imagine how much more money that farmland would make if it was in fruits and vegetables or grass-fed livestock? And we can still produce it in a way that's affordable. It's just more value than feed crops. So there's an efficiency to think of on that level. Now, if I was thinking about this in the Farm Bill, what programs would I watch for? I think the most directly relevant to folks with food policy councils and directly related to funding would be the Farmers Market and Local Food Promotion Program. It's not just farmers markets. This does your capacity building, your promotion, your programming to promote local and regional foods. That's a great one. That has been growing in funding over time, and the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition is kind of the champion for that. The other, if you care about nutrition, is I'd watch how the Food Insecurity Nutrition Incentive Program grows. This is where you use incentives for folks to buy more fruits and vegetables, and hopefully locally produced ones, with SNAP dollars. It probably won't change SNAP on this farm bill, but maybe in the next farm bill, the pilot programs will have figured out how to do that at a large scale. And that's groups like the Fair Food Network and Wholesome Wave that work on it. So I'd watch how those two develop. And then if you care about like the macro level policy stuff that Parke was talking about, do follow how crop insurance reform works. And again, that would be the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition. There's very brief materials and there's very detailed materials on their website. And if you really want to get into it, look at the Land Stewardship Project in the Upper Midwest. They're kind of the engine behind those proposals.
Let's switch over for a moment to the topic of urban agriculture. Many food policy councils have worked on urban agriculture, community gardening, etc., issues around zoning changes, programs to support more, very local, very urban, even unconventional forms of food production. Are either of you familiar with the marker bill that has been either submitted or planned for urban agriculture? Do you see any other opportunities to build out federal interest in supporting urban agriculture? Either one of you want to take that? Parke, you're nodding.
I'm going to let Alan take that one first.
So I don't work on the Farm Bill professionally as much anymore, but I will say that urban agriculture did have a foothold in the 1990s. And every single farm bill that's been an urban agriculture bill proposed. And I think the key thing for moving it along is really growing the base of support for it in terms of the members of Congress, and probably trying to find other supporters. And I haven't followed this bill specifically, but on the last farm bill, it was primarily the Progressive Caucus of the Democratic Party and the minority caucuses. And so with the majority being in the Republicans, I would think try and get some Ag Committee members to support it, and try and get some Republican members to support it. I think that would be really key. You need to get a voting bloc where it's politically necessary to address urban agriculture. Or you can try to have a really strong champion and a single senator on the Ag Committee that makes it their top request. That is ultimately more risky if you don't have a House supporting it. But I think growing the political constituencies for urban agriculture is essential for it passing in the next farm bill.
I do have a contribution from a listener who says that Senator Stabenow from Michigan is working on an urban agriculture marker bill. So I think let's certainly pay attention to that. One area where we have I think seen direct support, though perhaps not as obvious, has been with the Community Food Project grant program, competitive grant program operated by USDA, NIFI, and spending about $9 million a year. And many of the projects that have been funded at the local level are around urban agriculture or various forms of, let's say, unconventional agriculture and food production. And it's certainly worth paying attention to how that project gets addressed in the Farm Bill, and opportunities to make perhaps changes in that program that would benefit communities. But it is certainly it's been a prime area, though perhaps a bit understated in terms of what it has done to address urban agriculture. As we're looking at how we kind of build a bigger tent and how we perhaps work together more effectively, how do we collaborate, how we become a bit more unified, we know from the history of working together that we don't always work together as perfectly and harmoniously as we would like to, and perhaps as we should. Any thoughts from either one of you on taking, as you both have an historical perspective, and how do we begin, how can we perhaps avoid conflicts, or how do we at least acknowledge that they may exist? And ironically, those conflicts aren't always with the sort of the larger players in the agricultural world. Sometimes they are our friends. I know it's perhaps risky business to go too far into this, but I'd certainly be interested in any thoughts on how we can build that bigger tent and perhaps address conflicts that we know from the past have emerged.
You know, I listen to cross-cultural conversations in food policy all the time with immense interest. I just love it. I like watching the arguments, and I also like watching the occasional discoveries of common ground. And so I think about somebody who cares about local food policy councils and is very interested in local and sustainable agriculture, and the types of conversations that you can have with fairly traditional commercial growers in the U.S. And like it's amazing how diverse the routes the conversations can take. So you might be in a conversation with a commercial grower, and you find out that this commercial grower has an almost so you'll run into people who are violently opposed to organic agriculture. They consider sort of organic agriculture to be a personal attack, and you'll be in on this conversation, and you'll be thinking to yourself, it wasn't that personal. In fact, it seems to be like organic agriculture is a fairly constructive movement. You know, it's like about it's a non-governmental movement to have a certain new production practice certified, and so that the labeling can be nice and clear. Then you'll talk to the same farmer, and you'll find out that that farmer is highly concerned about the loss of cooking traditions and how the commercialism of food and the unhealthiness of packaged food and restaurant foods. And so you'll find in the same conversation common ground and sort of strong opposition on issues where you might sort of wish for joint effort. And so my feeling is just have a thick skin and listen broadly. Talk to lots of people, and don't write anyone off just because there's one thing that you're interested in that they really don't like. That you'll find other opportunities in ways that may surprise you.
I agree with Parke. Trying to find that common ground is really the key thing. When I think about it, to me that means stay in dialogue with these other groups who you may not have much purchase with now, because it may change in the future. And the reason is change is a long-term game. I can remember waiting in the lines for these hearings in Congress, really long lines. You have an hour or two to kill, and you start chatting with everyone up and down the line. And every now and then, some of the leading anti-hunger nutrition advocates will be there. So I'm the little local food system guy. It's 2005. No one knows what's going on with local food systems or farmers markets. They all think it's a fad. And from those relationships, staying in dialogue with those groups has led to more acceptance that farmers markets can be a way to address food insecurity. And it led to the opportunities created through the Food Insecurity Nutrition Incentive Program, where that was not opposed by the anti-hunger community and the nutrition community. But that took 7, 8 years of dialogue before the policy started to inch a little bit towards change. That's the key thing, is staying in dialogue with some of these groups. Don't be intimidated, don't feel brushed off. The other thing that I would do, which is probably unique to me, is that I would engage the opponents. I would try to find common ground on some common terms, like economic development is a great common term across sectors. When we talked about urban poverty and rural poverty, and we wanted to do local food system development to create jobs, economic development was the linchpin. Same thing with nutrition affordability. Also, going into some of those people who you hear of on the news who are just kind of like angry members of Congress, going in and talking with them about some of this stuff actually resulted in them to stop opposing it, allowing things to occur, the sharing of information along the way. But the key thing was not running out and blogging about it or tweeting about it, treating it respectfully, as essentially a confidential conversation, because they do want to help it, but the optics of the politics may not allow them to do it. But engage with them, because over time, they will be there. in some way. And that's actually what's happened with some of the mainstream farm groups around local food systems.
I'm going to add just one based on a comment that was made by one of our listeners. It looks like a comment I could have made myself, and I probably can guess who it came from, but it's a good tip, I think, for groups doing local work. And that is, do not forget your own city councils, and do not forget your own county commissioners and other local elected bodies. Go to them and talk to them about not just about the Food Policy Council, but the Farm Bill. Tell them what their stake is in the Farm Bill, and ask them to perhaps pass resolutions that would support certain measures that are under consideration or likely to come into consideration in the near term. Once they get on board and they pass that resolution, they become your partners, and they in turn will speak with and work with your district or your state's congressional delegation. So make them your partners, keep them informed about the Farm Bill, and make sure they understand that programs that come out of the Farm Bill usually result in a lot of dollars flowing into those particular cities, counties, and states. So I just want to share that bit of advice for folks. It's also important to pay attention to the flow of money once a bill is once the Farm Bill is passed, once there's a program, once there's a funding level determined. There's also often an appropriation process, but at the very least, there's money that has to flow, usually through the U.S. Department of Agriculture. It may go to a state agency, may find its way down to the local level. So your work is not done once the Farm Bill is passed. Oftentimes, that's when the work begins. That's when you have to make sure that you're able to take advantage of these programs and the money that's flowing from them. I'm wondering, Karen, if you're spotting any other questions you want to bring up?
The only other question that I thought would be interesting to hear about is one about metrics and indicators. So for food policy councils looking at kind of telling the story of what's happening in their communities, do you have any suggestions for any measurements or metrics or indicators that they could be tracking or collecting information on that would be helpful for them to tell their story of what's happening in their communities?
I think we're missing some of the metrics that we would most like. Food security measures are a good sort of high profile measure of food related hardship. To me, one of the things that's interesting is the individual items. So there's sort of a slightly fussy tradition in food security measurement research of how we consolidate and get sort of an overall marker from the 18 food related questions. But I think if you read buried in the annual USDA report, you see the individual questions are also interesting. I'm working with a PhD student, Mahreen Ismail, on sort of keeping track of the different proposals that are coming in the upcoming nutrition part of the debate for the Farm Bill, and also on the the research literature that comes to bear on it. I was thinking of Alan's comment about the food and security nutrition incentives, or FINI, and the different paths of work that influence a policy like that. He was talking about the relationship building and the sort of steady, persistent advocacy over many years that mattered. I worked on the evaluation for the Healthy Incentives pilot, which was a pilot study with a strong research design, a random assignment research design here in Hampden County, Massachusetts, that measured the effect on food spending and food intake of an incentive for fruit and vegetable purchase that operated through the SNAP EBT card. And so I think that taking interest in these metrics and in supporting research in your area of, supporting and using research in your area of interest is also valuable.
I think it brings up a good point, Parke. When you're going to meet with your member of Congress, or anyone else for that matter, to advocate for particular measures within the Farm Bill, be current with the evaluations, be current with the metrics, know what some of the reports and studies have said about the efficacy of these different programs. Don't just walk in and say, yeah, we want you to support this because we think it's a cool idea. We'd really like it. We really think that this has a measurable impact on our community, on people's health, on the economic viability of agriculture.
Mark,
Yeah, go ahead.
Going along with that point, if you don't have metrics or evaluation, I think one of the key things that you can do, especially if you're a food policy council, is go back to that idea I said that the Farm Bill is a political problem. So if you're not talking about how do we spend money most effectively to get the healthiest food to the most people, which is what Parke was talking about with the Healthy Incentive Pilot, then bring together the different people on your council. Bring together the producers, the consumers, the business people, the constituents, because what you're showing there is a political solution. That's the evaluation metric. Hey, we got these different people to all talk together, and we realize food and agriculture is really important, and we're here to show you, basically as a symbol, that your constituents may also see these connections as well, if we can work on the messaging for it. So that's another way to communicate impact.
I just thank you, Alan. That's a good elaboration. I do want to highlight one resource that one of our viewers has brought forward, the Coalition on Human Needs, which works closely with Food Research and Action Center with FRAC, does some great analysis on the safety net programs and nutrition assistance. So I would urge you to check out the Coalition on Human Needs as well when you're doing your background research. I think, Karen, we're getting close to the end here. I wonder, Parke or Alan, if you'd like to make an extremely brief summary statement or add anything else that you feel is important.
No, thanks for engaging in this conversation. I think for food policy councils, it's extremely valuable, even if it's not the only thing you focus on, to take interest in national policy making, including at the Farm Bill level. I'm glad you're doing the work that you do, because I think it's also important that we not only pay attention to these sort of national politics, but so I think sort of mutual communication on these topics is a super good idea.
Alan?
And I'd say thank you for including me here in this book, in this group. I would say if you want to get into the nitty gritty of this, I did write a book on it, and it basically goes through 40 years of policymaking history on how this all happened. The key thing I'd say is be optimistic. Change takes a long time, but it does, especially with a Farm Bill. Every 5 years, there's something new happening in this area. It's worth spending your time in it if you have the time to spend in it. There is opportunity, despite what the media might say about this cloud of politics that's kind of reigning over us right now. It is reaching out to your members directly is probably the most influential thing that you can do.
Thank you, both Alan and Parke. Really fabulous contributions today. Really appreciate it. Good to be with you. Gonna kick it back to you, Karen, and for any wrap-ups.
Thank you all so much. Mark, thank you for moderating. Thank you to our audience for submitting questions and helping us to keep a lively discussion. And Parke and Alan, thank you for the wonderful and lively, informative discussion. We greatly appreciate you joining us this afternoon. We also hope that you will join us on the 21st for a webinar with Robert Martin on the federal budget process. It should be an interesting conversation as well. And with that, we will adjourn. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Nice to talk to you.
Bye now.